Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, everyone. I'm Tom O'Brien. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for International Trade and Transportation at California State University, Long Beach. We're a logistics and supply chain and transportation workforce center. Today, we want to share with you as the first of a three-part webinar series, what we think is an interesting story about the development of a new certificate program in sustainable freight foundation, sustainable freight operations. We think it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is the partnership that was instrumental to developing the program, which included not only the education sector, but a working group from industry, the workforce community, and two state of California agencies, the California Energy Commission and the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. It's a program that was developed during COVID. So what was initially designed to be an in-person, in-classroom, on-the-ground program migrated over the course of last year to meet the needs of everybody's reality. And there are lessons to be learned from that. We think the story also reflects the changing demand for how training is delivered. And this is independent of COVID. Training that increasingly is responsive to student demands for a more menu-driven approach, a more self-directed approach to education. It also reflects, I think, a changing nature of training that is much more interdisciplinary in nature. What we want to share with you is at the intersection of both freight systems and energy systems, which mirrors both state mandates, which is driving a shift toward zero emission vehicles, but also more generally, operational changes in the freight sector that are demanding that people who work in it have a better understanding of energy systems. The program also incorporates some foundational skills, which is something else that I think is the hallmark of education and training, and in particular professional development today, which is that you can't just teach to discipline-specific needs, but you have to build foundational skills, and you'll be hearing more about that. And then finally, what we're going to be sharing with you is something that was designed with middle managers in mind, which the research that we did behind all of this tells us is necessary to fill a gap that's not currently being met by a lot of on-the-job training or work that's being done at community colleges or four-year institutions. So that's sort of the big picture setup. You'll be hearing from me a little bit more in a little bit. Right now, I would like to turn it over to Deanna Matsumoto to get the webinar started.
Thank you, Tom. And next slide, please. We have a lot to cover this session, and so I will quickly cover the agenda for today. Larry Rillera from the California Energy Commission will introduce the drivers of this California Sustainable Freight Action Plan Workforce Development Initiative. Diana Sanchez of CITT will present how we identified both the sustainable freight occupations and competencies required. Then I'll report back on participant takeaways from the program. Following will be a high-level overview of our course sessions. Tom O'Brien, Executive Director of CITT, will discuss this session, Introduction to Freight Systems and Sustainability, followed by Cameron Roberts of Roberts and Kahajiaris, who will provide an overview of his session, Introduction to Legal Issues in Sustainable Freight, followed by question and answers. Next slide, please. This is a three-part webinar series, and we hope you and your colleagues will be able to join us for the next two sessions so you can get a comprehensive view of this first of its kind certificate. Next Thursday, Kevin Magai will introduce his sessions, providing an overview of the energy and infrastructure ecosystem required for various goods movement facilities and operations. What is required of customers, service providers, and other colleagues in this transition to cleaner energy use? He'll then seg into a session on data and metrics and freight. How do managers effectively incorporate metrics into process improvement at their organizations? How can you effectively collect, interpret, and use data to benefit your organization? Our last session will feature Matt Schrapp, who will give a high-level overview of his session, Introduction to Regulatory Compliance. His objectives were for participants to acquire the necessary tools to identify the specific regulatory agencies and subsequent programs that directly impact and influence their day-to-day operations, and to develop a basic understanding of policy formulation, implementation, and enforcement of applicable programs, and to gain insight into the history, structure, makeup, and jurisdiction of appropriate state, local, and federal agencies. He'll give an overview of air quality policies in California, as well as federal air quality policies, and we'll briefly discuss Section 177, CARB actions, and CARB in-use standards. We'll also introduce our digital skills building session, where supply chain expert Sue Dexter showed students how to manipulate, analyze, and present data using Excel. Participants and observers will be on hand. I know there are some of you out there, and I haven't gotten out to invite you yet, but I hope you will be able to join us at the end of the final session for Q&A, where they can discuss their takeaways and how they were able to take the knowledge and skills learned in the certificate back to their workplaces and networks. I'd like to note that collectively, the instructors have over 125 years of industry subject matter expertise. They developed their curriculum specifically for the first and mid-level managers involved in sustainability activities and freight. The strength of this pilot program lays solidly on their contributions and dedication. And I also would like to thank the participants and the observers. During this time of COVID, almost all of their organizations faced contraction, furloughs, layoffs, yet they still plugged in and stayed with this program and dedicated themselves to this program, providing us with very valuable feedback on how we could both improve and expand the program. So thank you very much. As this is a virtual environment, we're asking that the session also serve as a collective learning opportunity. Please add to the chat or reach out to Tom and myself through email if you have other content that we could add to this curriculum. We're building it out and would like to be relevant to freight stakeholders. You know best the skill sets needed for your organizations as they relate to sustainability and freight, and we would appreciate your input. Okay, next slide, please. I think that, Maddie, can we go down one other slide? Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, my apologies. I'm going to go back to Tom. I'm going to briefly introduce all of our speakers. Tom O'Brien is the Executive Director of the Center for International Trade and Transportation at Cal State Long Beach. Next slide, please. Larry Rillera, Air Pollution Specialist, working with zero emission vehicle manufacturing, workforce, and equity concerns with the California Energy Commission. Next slide, please. Diana Sanchez, she's was our research associate at the Center for International Trade and Transportation, and she will be starting a new job as a financial analyst in the radar program at Raytheon in a few weeks. Next slide, please. Cameron Roberts is a partner at Roberts and Cahajiaris in Long Beach, California, and he has extensive experience working in international trade. He's also an instructor with the Global Logistics Professional Designation Program here at Cal State Long Beach. Next slide, please. And this is me, Deanna Matsumoto, and I had the honor and privilege of working as program manager for this pilot program. Next slide, please. So our poll question number 1, this is, okay, which of these occupations include job tasks related to sustainability? Okay, Maddie, did people sign up, submit?
Yes, we have 18 people. I'll go ahead and post the result.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Okay. The answer is all of these jobs require tasks in sustainability, and this list has grown to over 100 now. So that is one of the reasons, as Tom discussed earlier, we feel that they are foundational for workforce development. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so now I will turn this over to Larry Rillera, and he will talk about drivers of this pilot workforce development program. And we've also, since this is a virtual environment, we wanted you to get to know our speakers better. So there's a little question session for each of the speakers. Which of the following statements is not true? Okay. Maddie, can you put the answers up? Okay, Larry, go at it. What's the answer?
Spilling the beans, it would be Larry has never made tamales. Thank you, everybody, for indulging in that poll question.
Hey, next slide, please. Great.
Perfect. Great. Thank you, Deanna. And thank you, Maddie, and all attendees. Really looking forward to the presentation. There's a lot of content in the freight workforce sector with respect to this project. You will get not only during this webinar, but the subsequent webinars as well. I will tee up, if you will, and provide the landscape and the background for the pilot project. With that, let's go ahead and get started. Next slide, please, Maddie. A little bit about the source of funding and support for the project. That is the California Energy Commission's Clean Transportation Program. The program was established in 2007 and provides up to $100 million per year for funding. One purpose of the program is to develop and deploy transportation technologies to help the state achieve climate change and economic development goals. Approximately $35 million has been invested in our workforce training and development portfolio across a suite of innovative companies, public agencies, and partners. Next, please, Maddie. Before the California Sustainable Freight Action Plan, the Clean Transportation Program targeted investments in zero-emission vehicle, or ZEV, freight vehicles and equipment at California's seaports. I have noted here the range of freight technology as well as the range of infrastructure to support technology deployment. These are the types of zero-emission vehicle technologies that must be deployed in order to achieve climate and air quality goals. Next one, please, Maddie. The CEC has also established a Ports Energy Collaborative with the seaports to review and discuss on a regular and monthly basis the deployment of new ZEV technologies and discuss energy-related issues such as lighting and microgrids. I would also note a few projects where we have workforce elements such as technology demonstrations and workforce assessments at the Port of Long Beach, a workforce evaluation project under CARB's Zero and Near Zero Emissions Freight Facilities Project, or ZANZEF, and a live on the streets right now $45 million solicitation released by the Energy Commission and the California Air Resources Board that includes a requirement for the development of a ZEV workforce action plan. Specific to this presentation is a focus on one element of the California Sustainable Freight Action Plan for a workforce pilot project. Next slide, please. In July of 2015, California issued an executive order that required state departments to develop a freight action plan that establishes killer targets to improve freight efficiency, transition to zero emission technologies, and increases competitiveness of California's freight system. The California Sustainable Freight Action Plan was released in 2016. A state interagency team informed by broad stakeholder input also conducted workshops, webinars, specific presentations to staffs and boards and commissions from regional agencies to the state's California Freight Advisory Committee. We also met with industry leaders, environmental groups, and other groups as well. The action plan identified 9 separate state agency actions. Item number 8 was focused on ensuring that the future workforce meets the needs of a sustainable freight system. After the plan was released, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development led a 20-month work group process to discuss and determine how best to address and implement this item. Key stakeholders in the work group included the California Workforce Development Board, the CEC, CARB, California Resources Board, the seaports, technology companies, labor, and other entities. Next. To dive a little deeper into the project we will be covering today and over the next couple of webinars, and to set the context for the ensuing presentations by the panelists, the CEC entered into an agreement with Cal State University Long Beach in 2016. The budget for the pilot workforce project was only $175,000, and the project ended December of last year. A purpose of the project was to inform development of the CEC's workforce training policies and activities. Deliverables in the agreement include mapping skills and training in critical freight occupations, preparing career pathway maps, developing a workforce pilot concept, and providing a final project report. The focus of this webinar will be on the implementation and findings of the workforce pilot project. Next slide. So this concludes my presentation and introductory remarks. I have provided some information and resources here that you can look at with respect to the project and some of the elements that I had alluded to. I would also note that the Energy Commission has a live docket and a public process that is open to stakeholders at this webinar. If they are interested in submitting comments on issues related to EV charging, electric vehicle charging, and workforce training and development. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please put it in the Q&A box or in the chat. Okay, while we're waiting, I would like to introduce Diana. She will be, you can do the next slide, please, Maddie. Diana will provide information about research that led to the creation of the curriculum. The next slide, please. And here is Diana's poll question. Okay, let's see. Diana, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, I actually have been bit by a monkey before when I was traveling in Thailand. The correct answer is a ferret. I have never been in close proximity to one, probably for good reasons. All right. Thank you, Deanna, and thank you, Larry, for providing the context to this research. As mentioned, the California Energy Commission project is an effort to create a more competitive, more economic, and less polluting transportation system. In order to meet these goals and the ones mentioned by Larry, it's important that we have a skilled workforce that can use and manage new technology and equipment. And that's why we created this development pilot certificate program. In order to understand what was happening with the workforce market, we asked ourselves these principal research questions. The first one, what are sustainable freight jobs? And this is to understand what are current jobs being demanded that relate to sustainable freight, and what jobs would benefit from understanding what sustainable freight is. The second and third question is to understand the competency gap. So for example, if these are the skills being demanded by industry and these are the skills being taught by education and training, what is the disconnect between the two and how can we close the two? Or how can we close this gap? And the last question, the fourth one, is to understand the different training delivery methods in order to close this gap. Next question, or next slide, please. So we answered our questions by using an extensive methodology that pulled data from multiple sources. One source is Burning Glass, and this is a platform or program that provides labor market insights. So for example, if I wanted to know how many truck drivers were demanded in California, Burning Glass would be able to give me that answer. They also provide skills, knowledge, and abilities that are associated with each job title that I'm interested in learning about, relative to an industry. We also attended webinars and went to conferences when they were available at the time. And we did an extensive literature review of training programs as well. Once we gathered this information, we would present this to working groups, which were mentioned by Larry as well. And those happened throughout the entire, or almost the entire time we were collecting information. And these working groups would provide us feedback and input in order to improve the product and this pilot. We also collected data by conducting a survey that served to inform the development of future training programs. Another thing we did was conduct on-site visits to employers and education and trainers and conducted in-depth interviews. We visited employers from different businesses. For example, we visited an intermodal terminal as well as a freight forwarding technology company. And this was to provide or to gain insight as to what competencies needed, what jobs are available, and what are the potential career pathways to land a certain job within sustainable freight. Another method we used was reviewing job postings, and this was a great way to understand what hard and soft skills were being demanded by employers. And our findings were also referenced or cross-checked with the in-depth interviews. And lastly, we surveyed our participants throughout the course of the pilot. Next slide, please. Once we gathered our data from various sources, we targeted 8 industry sectors, which are shown here. And throughout the course of the pilot, we realized that this list needed to be expanded, and it now includes retailers, equity, and environmental justice organizations, maritime and public sector agencies as well. And actually, I'd like to take a moment and ask the audience if there are any suggestions for any additional industry sectors. Please let us know in the chat box. We are more than happy to hear your insight. Next slide, please. After identifying the targeted industry sectors, we refined the target middle management occupations based on the feedback from the instructors. So we started off with these 8, but again, during the process or the progress of the pilot program, we realized that we added to our list of occupational titles that would benefit from this program, and it now includes over 100 job titles in addition to the BLS or Bureau of Labor Statistic occupations that are listed. Next slide, please. This is a outline of the pilot certificate format. And as previously mentioned, when we were creating the program or the pilot, it was supposed to be a hybrid where students would go into the classroom and also join online. But because of the pandemic, it became completely online. And it was synchronous, which meant that students would have to log on at the same time that the professor was teaching, and everybody would be online and be live. The program was taught by subject matter experts, and the certificate also includes a collaborative capstone project. Students could access the assignments and the lectures using the learning management system through Cal State Long Beach. And once they completed the certificate, or once they completed all the modules and classes, they would obtain a certificate. And lastly, this certificate is targeted towards middle managers in operations. Next slide, please. So this is an illustration that shows the progression to complete the sustainable freight certificate. And the certificate includes an introduction to many topics which are shown here. And it also includes a capstone project. And once they were all completed, then you would obtain the certificate. And one thing to note is that a future aspiration of this pilot would be, or the certificate, would be for each topic to dive deeper and become its own module. And then once completing all the modules, you would obtain a certification. And I would just note there is a difference between a certificate and a certification, and for these purposes, the one presenting and what we've produced is for a certificate. Next slide, please. Okay, and lastly, the pilot does include a capstone project, and this was an opportunity for students to engage with one another. Our participants are working and they're from industry, and we created groups of people that came from different industries and had different occupations so that they can learn from one another and learn other challenges and barriers experienced in other industries and perhaps learn new solutions. In particular, for their assignment for the capstone project is they were given a fictitious drayage and warehouse establishment and then had to convert their fleet and material handling equipment to zero emission. And with that, next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Diana. Appreciate the background you provided. We have some questions we would like to address that are in the chat box. And one is let's see, I'm going to go back up to, I am interested in the role that community colleges can play in the workforce plan, and will that be discussed today? One aspect that I'll bring up, that we see this as a progression for technicians, for example, automotive technicians. Once they enter the first level managements, these skill sets would be very valuable to them. We've heard that that is a gap. And one of the assignments that students had to do, for example, was to transition their fleets using Excel skills to zero emissions by a certain benchmark, a benchmark year. And I think Tom has some other comments he'd like to make.
Yeah, thanks, Deanna. I think you're right about that. I also think that the opportunity for the community college and university partnership is the development of non-credit pathways, non-degree programs, so that, as Deanna said, maybe existing programs that the community colleges offer with regard to the development of hands-on skills for technicians. And I know in the world of Long Beach, where I exist, the Long Beach City College is a partner, and they have a partnership with the port as well in developing skill sets that are immediately employable in the freight sector. We have established partnerships with the City College to give credit for those programs for our own logistics and marine terminal operations program on the non-credit side. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to go outside of traditional degree pathways in this area of freight operations.
Right, thank you. And also we have a relationship with the advanced transportation and logistics sector in California. We also have, let's see, another question. Here, I'm sorry, Andrew McGee. I'm an automotive tech teacher at the community college in the Bay Area. And can you please chime into that? We'd really appreciate it. Then I'll go back to another question asking about whether this program is applicable to other states, which it definitely is with Section 177 states. So Andrew McGee, could you please unmute yourself?
I think he wanted to let us know so that we can reach out to him in case we had more or anything to share.
Definitely, that was the goal, but I'm unmuted now, so that's me.
Oh, thank you, Andrew.
But anyway, yes, I'm a logistics officer at Travis Air Force Base in California, and I teach at a community college in the Bay Area. So I deal with logistics on a global scale in terms of the advanced stuff that we're dealing with too.
Thank you very much. We definitely could arrange like a conversation if I get the information from, is this Birchman? I'm just trying to see. It's a little bit hard to look on the chat, but yeah, we'll try to coordinate afterwards. So thank you very much. Okay, there's another question. A lot of this is tied to California. How many states are into this and recognize a certificate? So this is just a pilot, but we've gotten a lot of research, we've gotten a lot of responses of interest nationally because of the Section 177 states. There are 15 states now, and Washington, D.C., they have an MOU, and they will be following California's emissions regulations. So they will have as well regulations to transition their fleets to use of cleaner fuels. And if anybody else would like to add anything, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and chime in real quickly here, Deanna.
Okay.
I think what we've seen in this early part of the presentation is a focus on seaports with respect to the pilot and more specifically to the certificate program that Diana had mentioned. But I think we can see applications, at least in California, to land ports. We can also see application to the warehouse and distribution centers that dominate the kind of inland empire, if you will. And then all the other seaports throughout the United States. Certainly for immediate and near-term implementation and alignment, but perhaps there's still a lot of learning and some things we can incorporate on the global stage as well. We need to look at around the world and see where sustainability is also being implemented in the channels and the modules that we had looked at.
Yeah, and if I could add to what Larry is saying, one of the findings of the pilot is that the need for the combination of foundational skills in transport operations and in energy systems management is easily transferable to, for example, the transit sector, particularly those transit agencies that are in the process or looking to adopt battery electric technology or other alternatives for their fleets. So while yes, this pilot was done in the context of a California specific freight plan and policy, I think we're finding some of the outcomes are much more universal. And I think that's one thing that we'll be talking about throughout not only this, but the subsequent webinars.
Thank you. Okay, let's see, next slide, please. Okay, I will be going over the takeaways that participants reported that they were able to apply at their workplace. And you can go ahead and quickly go to my, I realize we're running out of time, so you could quickly go to my poll question and then I will provide the answer. So, okay, could you please present the answers and then I will provide my answer. Okay, I have actually worked with every single demographic on that poll, so thank you very much. Okay, next slide, please. So we're going to first take a look at the participant cohort. You can see, you can slide to the next three, Maddie, please, thank you. You can see we had a cross section of freight stakeholders: rail, air, drayage, trucking, maritime tug and barge, manufacturing, both inland and seaports, freight forwarders, terminals, and warehousing. We had such a robust response for this pilot that we created an observer cohort, which included those in the public sector who are involved in freight research and policy. In subsequent programming, participants and observers provided feedback that being in the class together would be of high value for the networking, collaboration, and the removal of silos in the goods movement industry. Participants reported they were able to identify goods movement stakeholders and infrastructure requirements, developed process improvement methods using key performance indicators, and developed a deeper understanding of regulatory compliance. They also reported that they were able to develop an elevator speech or pitch, use Excel to manipulate data, and had an understanding of how to look at contracts to manage risk. So if you could scroll to the next slide, please, Maddie. Thank you. And one of the, something that I'd like to point out is to prepare for roles not yet defined in the sustainable freight landscape. There was a lot of feedback that we received that there was fear entering into the sustainability phase for a lot of, especially the smaller organizations. And the instructors were able to give concrete steps on how to implement these policies at their organizations. So I thought that was a very powerful statement that this program was able to accomplish. Okay, next slide, please. And these are the skill sets that they said they learned during the course of the certificate program. Next slide, please. Are there any questions or comments?
Deanna, there was a question just about the number of contact hours and the length of the program.
Oh, thank you. Contact hours were 20 hours. It was, the courses started at the end of August and they completed in November. And they did have homework assignments and then they had the Capstone Project. Next slide, please.
We do have someone raising their hand. I'm going to go ahead and unmute Gil.
Okay, Gil, let's see. I'm not seeing the question.
Hello.
Hello?
Yeah, this is Gil. I didn't have a question. I left one in the chat. And so I'm good.
Do you want to? Okay, you were the ones asking about if this certificate was applicable to other states as well, right?
Yeah, I was the one that was curious about that, and about, because like there's a lot of concern throughout the country with the light duty about having technicians prepared for the sudden shift to electric vehicles, and how the technicians are going to have, there is no real transition. They have to just relearn, and about the challenges. But that was what that question was about. I didn't mean to disrupt. That was meant to be in the chat.
No, that's a good question, Gil. Appreciate that. I think, Maddie, if you wouldn't mind sharing a link to the webinars that were conducted last year, and perhaps that would set a little bit of some of the landscape, if you will, for the effort specifically for technicians. That would be helpful. Thank you, Gil. Thank you, Maddie.
Thank you. And next slide, please. Okay, here's our poll question 2. And this is about the size of vessels. Okay, and Tom, do you like
Right.
to? Yes.
Right. So the question is how many shoe boxes can fit into a 22,000 TEU vessel? For those of you not in the freight sector, that's a 20-foot equivalent unit, and those are essentially, that's the standard metric for a container. Most containers are double that size now, but how many can fit in? Yeah, we have a smart group. It is 300 million shoe boxes, and I think probably about 90 million iPads. So that sort of sets the stage for a discussion about why the need for sustainability in the freight sector.
Okay, next slide, please. Oh, you could go ahead and skip that because we went over that earlier. Okay, so now this will be Tom's question. So go ahead and put the poll up. Okay, you could present it, Maddie.
Very good. Yes, that is the one thing that I have not done while traveling. The rest are functions of me having lived overseas, serving in the Peace Corps, and attempting to get a picture taken at each of the state capitals in the US. So there's a reason I'm in transport. Next slide, please. I wanted to give you a little bit of overview and insight into the portion of the certificate that I taught, which was freight systems management. And this was sort of the introductory lesson for the program, one of which was to help define the role that different stakeholders play in freight operations. And that includes both private sector operators as well as the regulatory agencies that impact the movement of freight, which was central to our discussion of the development of statewide mandates for zero emission technology. But as I mentioned earlier, this is not an issue that's unique to the state of California. Wherever you are and whatever community that you might live in or work in where freight passes through, there's an impact. And increasingly, because of the rise of the phenomenon of e-commerce, we're seeing the impacts of freight activity at our doorstep. And so this sort of just is designed to give you an overview of where freight systems and the facilities that serve freight operations have an impact from an environmental perspective, and suggest or even demand a response that develops a more sustainable system. So there's the question of emissions and pollutants from trucks, trains, ships. There's the actual energy consumptions and the contributions to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, particularly for some of the gross polluters, which have included ocean-going vessels, but even those operations are significantly cleaner than they have been. There's incidents of crashes and accidents on the docks outside of the gates that are visible to local communities. There are also impacts from noise and other things like the potential impact on species and habitat from globalized trade. Next slide. This is an issue for all freight modes, and this is some work that I'm bringing to you via a colleague, Jean-Paul Rodriguez at Hofstra University. But one of the things to take away from this is that one of the things that makes for successful freight operations is being better able to document the impact of operations, so the development of key performance indicators, understanding contributions to global pollutants, and in some cases requirements that ask you to calculate the carbon footprint of your operations, and understanding what your customers expect from you. Many companies brand themselves with the sustainability of their operations, and being able to quantify that creates both demand for better information and new skills from the freight workforce. And I will, point out that all modes of transport are impacted by this, whether it's ocean shipping, short sea shipping, which we might also refer to as marine highways, which is barge transport, as well as rail, and then the trucks that are moving freight on our roads. Next slide, please. And there's a trade-off. One of the things that transport and freight companies are increasingly doing is balancing questions of energy efficiency with transport speed, right? So your companies are looking to sort of balance cost of operations with efficiency and speed, and also impact on the environment. And again, this suggests that this is all potential modes, and it's a transport-wide phenomenon, right? So this is the case with both freight and passenger transport. And it's another reason why I think there's applicability beyond the freight sector for the questions that we're asking. One example of how an industry sector might respond is what we call slow steaming, which is ocean-going vessels purposely reducing speed to improve efficiency and reduce costs. Next slide, please. So in response to all of these, this imperative to mitigate the environmental impacts of freight operations, the public sector looks to, if not mandate, to facilitate or encourage certain responses from private freight operators, and for those operators themselves to figure out what makes the most sense for them, both operationally and financially. And the story sort of I want to suggest here is that this is what is creating the demand for workforce strategies that look at the application of alternative fuels and their relationship to overall company operations, right? So there are truck fuel efficiency and emission standards that are developed at the national or the state level, and that's evidenced by what we're talking about today in the Sustainable Freight Action Plan. But there are a number of other programs that would require a similar type of shift within a company's operations around the globe, right? We don't have them as much in the U.S., but from the European model, there are low emission zones, places like the low emission zone in central London, or the Milan Historic Center low emission zone, which would suggest freight companies, transport companies having to respond to similar issues. Looking at shifts to alternative modes, like shifting from freight truck to rail or to that short sea shipping barge operations, also suggests the need for calculations between the cost of one mode of transport versus another. The short-term impacts of capital investment in new fleets or retrofitting of fleets versus the longer-term savings, perhaps, in fuel costs. So these are, again, things that might impact multiple modes of transport. Next slide, please. Some of the solutions might involve negotiated programs, voluntary, what we might call self-regulation on the part of industry to avoid further action on the part of government, right? And understanding the role of different stakeholders, who is in a position to develop new regulatory measures and enforce them is another valuable skill that's needed in the workforce today. The relationship between freight operators and local planners, particularly when it comes to e-commerce, where are delivery vans able or not able to park, and what is the impact on service time, on the number of tickets you might get that will add to your bottom line. These are all part of the operational questions that relate to environmental standards, mandates, and how a company responds. Next slide. And then we have other strategies, some of which are unique to the port sector, which, as Larry suggested, is one thing that was central to our pilot program, but questions of congestion pricing, gate pricing as a way to encourage truck traffic to move to the off-peak, where there's less potential impact with daytime passenger traffic. And the example that most of us in California would point to would be the off-peak gate program called Pure Pass. But for a trucking company, that means understanding the cost of doing off-peak operations in terms of labor, in terms of access to warehousing and distribution or storage facilities. And so being able as a mid-level manager to understand what all of this means for recruitment and retention of drivers, ability to secure labor in the off-peak, is the type of issue that this program, I think, would help someone address. Let's go on to the next slide, looking at time. And then there are technology-based solutions like intelligent transportation systems, which involve, in some cases, capturing real-time data, real-time traffic information, application-based smartphone app-based information on cargo availability. All of those things are being adopted, and in the wake of COVID-19 at a more accelerated pace for companies. So one of the things that was certainly included in our program was the impact of new and rapidly developing data management systems and how mid-level managers would have to incorporate it into their day-to-day business. Okay, and next slide. And the one thing I wanted to sort of end this piece with is that while we saw the potential for wide-scale applicability of the program in the freight sector, I think one of the reasons why the people who selected the program came, I think, disproportionately from the world of drayage, sort of local transport and trucking, is that trucking is in many ways the most visible of the supply chain. It's the one that frustrates you when you're behind a truck on the freeway. And so it's often the first target of regulatory measures. And it's also the reason why you're seeing innovation in the middle mile and in the last mile and in port-related traffic. So these are just some examples. But it speaks to the fact of the relationship between freight operations, innovations, and sustainability.
All right, thank you, Tom. And you have a question in the Q&A. How does ocean shipping have no carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide emissions? It seems that way from the graph.
That may be a question of the color coding, because certainly there are There are SOx and NOx that come of ocean transport. So.
Okay.
Yeah, the shades of blue might be the problem. Particulate matter is PM as well.
All right. Let's see. Maddie, could you scroll down to this slide that follows? Yes, follows this one. Yeah, so this was selected session feedback from participants. And you could see that they reported that they had an increased empathy and understanding of different actors in the supply chain. Challenges to drayage outfits in particular were noted by participants. And the next slide, please. Okay, and you can go ahead to the next slide. Next slide, please.
1 second, sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Experiencing a out of order slide. Oh, there we go.
Okay, great. So next will be Cameron Roberts. He will give an overview of legal issues and sustainable freight. So go ahead and post his question. Okay, Cameron, you can answer your little polling session there.
Very good. Thank you so much for the introduction. And you're correct. If that wasn't as hard a question as I thought it might have been. Yes, Malaysia. I've traveled to all of these countries, and for those who are unaware, Malaysia has fairly strict rules on alcohol because of Sharia law being in place in a number of parts. So you're all on the money. Very good. And just by way of background, I've been, as mentioned in the slide, I've been engaged in international trade for approximately 30 years. Made my first trip abroad in the 1990s and visited a number of people that I worked with at Harper Robinson back in the mid 80s, mid to late 80s. So it's been an interesting ride. At this point, I'd just like to briefly go over my slides here and give you some idea of what my role is as an instructor here and my engagement for legal issues in sustainable freight transportation. Really, the goals and objectives of the students are not dissimilar from other transportation courses that we teach at Cal State Long Beach, in that we're trying to give a holistic understanding of how the supply chain works, understanding how domestic and international trade interface with one another, the rules, the regulations, the legal regimes, the regulators, all of which play various roles throughout the supply chain at different moments in time. There are some degree of boundaries, but there's a lot of overlap of the Venn diagram. And it's interesting to see, at least from my perspective, and I think from the students' perspectives, how these different regimes work with one another, how regulators collaborate and cooperate, and to whom is customs working today or some other regulator, because keep in mind that several of the government regulators, particularly customs, their role is largely to enforce the regulations that apply to other regulators. So whether it be Food and Drug, or it be USDA, or it be some other issue like intellectual property, there can oftentimes be an enforcement situation where customs is acting as a police officer and they're enforcing the rules of this other third-party agency. The course really does focus in the main on the strategy, planning, negotiating, and contracting of risk. Risk, can run, anything can be a risk in many respects. There's a risk of delay, there's risk of lost cargo or damage. Then there's also the risk of breaching a contract. In this particular environment, we're talking about the sustainable freight contracting, and how do carriers and third parties and other members of the supply chain, whether they be cargo owners or they be importers or resellers, what are their roles in this, and how do they manage their risks based on their undertakings developed by those roles? So these are the issues that we kind of struggle with and try to balance, because oftentimes one person may not even understand the role that they're taking on because they don't understand what the implications are of what they've offered to do. Carriers have particular liabilities that, for example, freight forwarders in the international sense of the word don't have. Conversely, freight forwarders domestically have carrier liability and are subject to many carrier laws and regulations. So it's an unfortunate fact that we have a lot of words that don't necessarily mean the same thing. And it's important to recognize where you are, what hat you're wearing, and whether or not you're acting as more or less than a carrier, because this is one of the great divides within transportation. And so we also look at, how do those different companies interact with each other to shift the risk of sustainability and meet the goals and objectives, particularly of the United Nations 3030. This is a group of rules and there's not rules, but they're an NGO type of expectation, if you will, that a lot of governments and companies and other parties and stakeholders are all shooting for. Some people are shooting for 3035, some people are shooting for 2035 or 2050, and there's variations on that theme in terms of the timeline. But objectively speaking, the goal is all the same. We want to get to a sustainable freight model where we have reduced greenhouse gases, and we want to ensure that all of our partners throughout the supply chain are going to be following suit and meeting those objectives. Can we switch to the next slide, please? So as I briefly mentioned, when we talk about, who are you, what are you doing, what are your authorities, what authorities do you hold? Because that's really the way we can tether the individual members of the supply chain to a particular regulator. What are your authorities, and how do you hold yourself out? The next, we have to define, what do we mean by sustainable freight? I just touched on it a moment ago, but there are particular benchmarks concerning NOx and other things that companies may set up for themselves as determining what is sustainable freight. There may be municipal regulations, there may be state regulations, there may be federal regulations, and there may be these general or more broad international treaties to which parties can all become a member of. Obviously, the Biden administration is making an about face with respect to participation in the Paris Accord. So we will see, I expect, especially in the area of environmental regulation, a sea change with respect to what the federal government's role is in all this. I think they will definitely look to California. And so a little bit of this is predicting the future about what will happen and how it will happen. And then we look at transportation intermediaries, the infrastructure, the intermodal movement of goods. And then we say, taking those first 3 bullet points, who has the risk and how can we shift it, or how can we utilize third parties to manage it? You can either shift it by contract, which basically says that the party on the other side of that contract is going to take ownership and responsibility for all of those sustainable freight goals, for meeting those goals, for mitigating the NOx, and for using electric vehicles and other sustainable freight models. And then there's the question of, well, if that's not possible, can you insure that risk? There's a great role for insurance companies to play in this. However, the method by which insurance companies work typically is about, what is the risk? What is the likelihood? What are the actuarial responses to that? And then will money make this all better? Because the insurance companies are there to provide a policy benefit at the end of the day. Now, some of the sustainable freight contracts that we looked at and some of the model contracts that we looked at really went beyond just a model of financial compensation. One of the unique things about this area is how can you help the customer obtain their goals and objectives? How can you internally obtain the goals and objectives that you have set for yourself? And those two are both, obviously outward looking and inward looking. So the inward looking is something of more about, how does the company manage itself? How does the corporate governance work? What mechanisms do you have in place? What are your policies and your procedures? And at the same time, how do you project that onto third parties using model contracting? What we did is we went around the United States, went around the EU and to other governments, trying to look for models. Model contracting is a common practice, both undertaken on the intellectual side as well as the practical side. And so we looked at a number of model contracts that offered structure and kind of cut and paste ideas for inserting clauses into your master services agreement, your transportation contracts, and your internal policies and procedures. These are all essentially contracts either with yourself or with others as to how you're going to maintain the business, how you're going to operate the business, and how you're going to be held to account if things don't go the way you want them to. These more, shall we say, progressive contracts and progressive models, especially out of Europe, because we did look at a number of UK-driven policies, mostly because they're in English and follow a common law platform. The EU obviously has the European model of law to deal with. There's a code section, and there's the Napoleonic Code by which their legal system tends to lean. So looking to the English common law models tends to be a little more fruitful for our purposes here in the United States, because our legal model follows, according to the English because of the colonial history and just the experience with common law. And what we found there is some interesting hybrids of situations where if you don't help the company meet its goals, you might have to go out and purchase carbon credits. You might have to go and plant trees. And you might have to do other things that the company then that you breached on behalf of can then hold out and use as its own. So if you bought that tax credit or planted that tree, that's essentially for the benefit of whoever your customer is, because your customer's goal is to reach X, and you're supposed to help them reach X. And that's really the tenor of all of these contracts, certainly with third parties, shippers, and large importers, your Cargills, your other large companies. So we look at the large company examples, Fortune 100 traded companies that have all set, basically their banner both in marketing and in their contracting policy. And there's a reflection on that on both ends. We also looked at how this sustainable freight model is good marketing. And we pulled from some marketing papers written by academics about how this is actually good business and how it can help your business grow by adopting a sustainable model and using it as a competitive advantage in the marketplace. And I think, recently you can look to GM's pledge, I think it was 3 days ago, where they're pledging to make 100% electric vehicles in the next 10 years, or I think 2035, if my memory serves right. So these are the things we want to look at. Now, why are they doing that? And they're doing that because they want to project an image of being sustainable, being a part of the solution. And many of their customers, no doubt, like the large automobile rental companies, your Hertz's and the like, they're demanding that they have fleets of cars. So large purchasers and large corporate purchasers of automobiles are going to face or force them to adopt these models. Then we ended up in a conclusion by asking all of the students to draft a sample or a model contract, some clauses that they might be willing to or could use in their business life. You know, if they didn't have that, we would certainly, we were looking to accept examples that could be used in industry. Excuse me, take a sip of water here. Or used with relationships between operators like LAX or the ports or others that they might be interested in putting into their leases or other agreements. So there was an opportunity for everybody to participate in this, no matter where you are in the supply chain. And if we go to the next slide, please. I was really happy to see a lot of the feedback that we got on the class, particularly this application of theory to practical reality. I'm a big believer, and I think it speaks, I can speak pretty freely for doing this now for almost 20 years at Cal State Long Beach. One of the things that's great about these programs and these you know, things that we undertake here at Cal State is the ability to focus on both the theoretical and the practical. So people who participate in this, if you're having your you know, company members are allocating their time to come to these types of classes and to learn about sustainability, they're not just going to get pure theory that no one can apply. We literally had people, and as you can see here from some of the comments, they went literally back into the office to revisit different agreements and get them up to snuff on what they learned in the class. I think that really says it all when a student feels empowered enough to be able to go back to the company and make changes that benefit the company that has put him into the chair or her into the chair to begin with. And that's really my contribution to today. And I want to thank you for your time and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Cameron. His class really hit a chord with the participants. And mind you, they only had 2 hours with him, and they were able to revisit their contracts, and they learned how to add sustainability into their establishments. That's one of the overall goals that we wanted, was that participants would serve as change agents within their establishments. So thank you again.
My pleasure.
Are there any questions for Cameron or for any of the other speakers for today? Let's see. Okay, I don't see questions. I would like to thank all of you for attending. Tom will have some words about the current status of the certificate program. It's in development for a second generation iteration of it. I hope you will join us for the next sessions. And please do reach out to us with any comments or suggestions, because your contributions and input will make this workforce development program stronger and ever more relevant for sustainable freight workforce development. Thank you again, and I will cede to Tom.
Thanks, Deanna. Yeah, just one last comment about the potential audience for this. We are injecting the content from this into our logistics and marine terminal operations programs as a separate track to sort of to give it some new life and to learn more about the potential audience for this. But one of the things that the feedback from the pilot taught us as well was that there is an audience for the general content, the vocabulary of sustainable freight systems, but maybe perhaps not necessarily the need for a capstone project. So perhaps maybe a new employee who could use the content from this class as part of an onboarding exercise. So we're actually looking at offering this in sort of a shorter 1 to 3 hour snippet that could be that could work with programs of a multitude of employers, but that would basically be about the foundations of energy and freight systems. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the market or the audience for educational programs now is changing in general. Students are looking for industry recognized certificate programs that could be done in conjunction with or embedded in traditional degree programs, right? So that while you're pursuing a general MBA, there might be an interest in pursuing an industry recognized certificate alongside it. So one of the things I think that we'll also be looking at from a research perspective is ways we can include this in traditional institutes of higher education programs on the degree side as a degree certificate, or with content, as I said, embedded into individual courses that may have a freight focus, say within a transportation policy program or an economics program or something along those lines. So it's exciting to sort of see this, and because it's a very dynamic industry, we expect that there will always be new there'll be new data to respond to as the industry changes.
Well, thank you very much. It looks like we don't have any more questions in the chat box. Once again, we hope to see you next week. You can scroll to the next slide, please, Maddie. And please register and learn from Kevin McGuy and Matt Schrapp in the next 2 weeks. Thanks again, and enjoy your afternoon and your evenings.